If the US government can't go after Edward Snowden physically, they sure can go after his money. The Department of Justice is suing the NSA whistleblower and Macmillan Publishers for Snowden's best-selling memoir, Permanent Record. They want to seize all royalties not just from the book, but also from all the speeches that Snowden gave to keep himself alive. The reason for his global demonetization is quite simple. He violated the terms of service. The pre-publication review is a requirement to hand over to relevant government agencies any material former employees intend to talk about publicly or to anyone who is not authorized. The government has the right to reject or redact the publication in any way without giving any sensible explanation why. Failing to submit a publication for a review gives the government the right to seize all revenue generated from the forbidden material. So pretty much how YouTube works. The United States government has a history of going after its former intelligence and military employees for publishing material the government claims is secret, even if it has been widely reported by news media or publicly disclosed by the government itself. Mark Fallon, a former employee of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, had to wait 8 months for the government to review his book about torture policies during Bush tenure. In some cases, the government redacted newspaper citations, alongside information that had been previously published by government agencies. Snowden's memoir doesn't mention any new information that hasn't been previously reported by news outlets. Snowden, in fact, publicly revealed no documents at all. What he did was that he gave up his micro SD cards to the Guardian reporters and Laura Poitras. He then destroyed all of his copies and boarded a flight to Moscow, expecting a connecting flight to Ecuador, where he initially sought asylum before the government cancelled his passport. The first to publish a detailed book about the NSA mass surveillance documents was actually Glenn Greenwald, a lawyer turned journalist who was among the first 2 people who met Snowden in Hong Kong. Snowden wouldn't be the first to have the government take all of his profits from his book. A member of the team that assassinated Osama bin Laden lost $6.8 million to the US government for not submitting his book to a pre-publication review. Ishmael Jones, the pseudonym of a former CIA case officer behind the book The Human Factor Inside the CIA's Dysfunctional Intelligence Culture, submitted his book to the agency, but published it before the review was done. He had to give up all of his earnings that he donated to children of KIA American soldiers. But this arbitrary enforcement of pre-publication review might be violating the First Amendment. By claiming all the revenue, the US government is sending a message that supporting certain content is not allowed, and the ACLU argues the demonetization tactics are an attack on the freedom of speech and that the government is discriminatory in its enforcement policies, being strict to critical material but permissive to favorable one. The government has argued for years that Snowden compromised national security, but they have never provided any evidence or specific details to support their claims. But even if it was true, compromising national security is only considered to be a problem when you don't have favorable connections to the key positions of power. The FBI refused to charge Hillary Clinton for directing classified information to her private email server, even though at least 110 messages contained classified information, 22 of which had top-secret CIA designation. The FBI reports Clinton extensively used an unsecured phone to access her email accounts during her travels abroad, including the territories of sophisticated adversaries. This further exposed the secret documents, and the FBI said it was possible that hostile governments could have gained access to Clinton's email server. One of her emails revealed that she set up a private server because she didn't want her personal information to be accessible to Freedom of Information requests. It's almost as if she was worried about her privacy. And apparently she isn't alone, because it seems to be a common practice among high-positioned US officials to manage private accounts while in office. Disclosing classified information on at least 110 occasions for personal benefit is not considered a crime, but handing over evidence of government wrongdoing for public interest gets you a lifetime in prison. Snowden's defense has been crippled into a coma as he was denied to use public interest as a defense in front of a jury. There is no denying that Snowden broke some laws. The moment he stepped out of the NSA building with a micro SD card full of classified documents would alone guarantee him a significant prison time. But his defense is that he broke a lesser law to uphold the ultimate one, the US Constitution.
But you would acknowledge it was illegal.
It's pretty sketchy there.
As far as Snowden's defense goes, he seems to have solid standing. The NSA's bulk collection of phone records has been deemed illegal by a federal court. Following the revelations, the Congress passed the USA Freedom Act that, among other amendments, banned bulk collection, limited data harvesting to 2 hops, allowed private companies to publicly report on data requests, and introduced advocates representing public interest into the FISA court. In other words, this is the highest legislative institution in the US, proving Snowden's public interest defense for him. Stripping Snowden of his only defense turns a fair trial into a sentencing hearing.
Your guilt has been determined. This is merely a sentencing hearing. Now what will it be? Death or exile?
So what is this forbidden book about that makes it so dangerous? Well, it's a deep insight into Snowden's life, growing up in a family where government service is a centuries-old tradition, and his thrilling journey to become a whistleblower. If you followed the NSA revelations closely, this book won't give you any new information, but it will give you a detailed view of Snowden's emotions and thoughts as he was becoming aware of the depressing reality of mass surveillance he helped build, and especially during the nerve-wracking journey of taking the documents from the NSA all the way to the journalists in Hong Kong. Snowden lived a large part of his early life in the shadow of the NSA headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland, that was in part built on former property of the Snowden family. Both of his parents had top-secret security clearances in the intelligence community. His mother worked for the NSA as an insurance clerk, and his father served in the Coast Guard as a curriculum designer and electronics instructor. He was the one that introduced young Edward to gaming consoles and computer games, and even early programming. Snowden was fascinated by this technology and spent most of his time in front of a screen. He wasn't good at school and he never liked it there. Even today, Snowden stands by his claims that he could learn far more from exploring computer technology and playing games than listening to teachers in school. Snowden was inspired by his father's ability to repair any device at home, and his mother would give him math challenges. He loved the early internet of bulletin board systems, watched anime, and at the age of 13, he hacked a nuclear facility's website and reported its vulnerabilities to their operators. What's most valuable to me in his book is Snowden's philosophy. When he opens up about his thought processes, opinions, personal values, and emotions about issues as he encountered them. How the internet culture shaped his personality and implanted principles within him that gave him the strength to stand against the surveillance power. It's fascinating for me to realize how much I share his philosophies and values, and it makes me feel less alone in this quest. I decided to share with you a part of Snowden's philosophy that was most touching to me as I read the book. In Permanent Record, Snowden frequently recalls the good old days of the early internet and compares them with the corporate-centered, centrally controlled internet of today. I put together an excerpt of multiple different places from Permanent Record where Snowden most openly and directly speaks about his philosophy. I hope you enjoy these parts as much as I did. Back then, being online was another life, considered by most to be separate and distinct from real life. The virtual and the actual had not yet merged, and it was up to each individual user to determine for themselves where one ended and the other began. It was precisely this that was inspiring. The freedom to imagine something entirely new, the freedom to start over. Whatever Web 1.0 might have lacked in user-friendliness and design sensibility, it more than made up for by its fostering experimentation and originality of expression, and by its emphasis on the creative primacy of the individual. A typical GeoCities site, for example, might have a flashing background that alternated between green and blue with white text scrolling like an exclamatory chyron across the middle, read this first, without the give of a dancing hamster. But to me, all these kludgy quirks and ticks of amateur production merely indicated that the guiding intelligence behind the site was human and unique. Computer science professors and systems engineers, moonlighting English majors and mouth-breathing, basement-dwelling armchair political economists were all only too happy to share their research and convictions, not for any financial reward, but merely to win converts to their cause. As the millennium approached, the online world would become increasingly centralized and consolidated, with governments and businesses accelerating their attempts to intervene in what had always been a fundamentally peer-to-peer relationship. But for one brief and beautiful stretch of time, a stretch that, fortunately for me, coincided almost exactly with my adolescence, the internet was mostly made of, by, and for the people. Its purpose was to enlighten, not to monetize, and it was administered more by a provisional cluster of perpetually shifting collective norms than by exploitative, globally enforceable terms of service agreements. To this day, I consider the 1990s online to have been the most pleasant and successful anarchy I've ever experienced. Later on in the book, Snowden revisits this nostalgia for a long-gone Wild West era of the internet, when he faced the clearing process for a job at the CIA. He was afraid that he wouldn't get a job because of his embarrassing expressions of his past personality on messaging boards. Writing pseudonymously had meant writing freely, but often thoughtlessly, and since a major aspect of early internet culture was competing with others to say the most inflammatory thing, I'd never hesitate to advocate, say, bombing a country that taxed the video games, or carling people who didn't like anime into re-education camps. When I went back and reread the posts, I cringed. Half the things I said I hadn't even meant at the time. I just wanted attention, but I didn't fancy my odds of explaining that to a gray-haired man in horn-rimmed glasses peering over a giant folder labeled permanent record. The other half, the things I think I had meant at the time, were even worse because I wasn't that kid anymore. I'd grown up. It wasn't simply that I didn't recognize the voice as my own, it was that I now actively opposed its overheated hormonal opinions. I found that I wanted to argue with a ghost. I wanted to fight with that dumb, puerile, and casually cruel self of mine who no longer existed. I couldn't stand the idea of being haunted by him forever, but I didn't know the best way to express my remorse and put some distance between him and me, or whether I should even try to do that. It was heinous to be so inextricably, technologically bound to a past that I fully regretted but barely remembered. This might be the most familiar problem of my generation, the first to grow up online. We were able to discover and explore our identities almost totally unsupervised, with hardly a thought spared for the fact that our rash remarks and profane banter were being preserved for perpetuity, and that one day we might be expected to account for them. I'm sure everyone who had an internet connection before they had a job can sympathize with this. Surely everyone has that one post that embarrasses them, or that text or email that could get them fired. My situation was somewhat different, however, in that most of the message boards of my day would let you delete your old posts. I could put together one tiny little script, not even a real program, and all of my posts would have been gone in under an hour. It would have been the easiest thing in the world to do. Trust me, I considered it. But ultimately I couldn't. Something kept preventing me. It just felt wrong. To blank my posts from the face of the earth wasn't illegal, and it wouldn't even have made me ineligible for a security clearance had anyone found out. But the prospect of doing so bothered me nonetheless. It would have only served to reinforce some of the most corrosive precepts of online life. That nobody is ever allowed to make a mistake. That anybody who does make a mistake must answer for it forever. What mattered to me wasn't so much the integrity of the written record, but that of my soul. I didn't want to live in a world where everyone had to pretend they were perfect, because that was a world that had no place for me or my friends. To erase those comments would have been to erase who I was, where I was from, and how far I'd come. To deny my youngest self would have been to deny my present self's validity. I decided to leave the comments up and figure out how to live with them. I even decided that true fidelity to this stance would require me to continue posting. In time, I'd outgrow these new opinions too, but my initial impulse remains unshakable, and only because it was an important step in my own maturity. We can't erase the things that shame us, or the ways we've shamed ourselves online. All we can do is control our reactions, whether we let the past oppress us, or accept its lessons, grow, and move on. The internet I'd grown up with, the internet that had raised me, was disappearing, and with it so was my youth. The very act of going online, which had once seemed like a marvelous adventure, now seemed like a fraught ordeal. Self-expression now required such strong self-protection as to obviate its liberties and nullify its pleasures. Every communication was a matter not of creativity, but of safety. Every transaction was a potential danger. Meanwhile, the private sector was busy leveraging our reliance on technology into market consolidation. The majority of American internet users lived their entire digital lives on email, social media, and e-commerce platforms, owned by an imperial triumvirate of companies, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. An American intelligence community was seeking to take advantage of that fact by obtaining access to their networks, both through direct orders that were kept secret from the public and clandestine subversion efforts that were kept secret from the companies themselves. Our user data was turning vast profits for the companies, and the government pilfered it for free. I don't think I'd ever felt so powerless. Most of our lives, even if we don't realize it, occur not in black and white, but in a gray area, where we jaywalk, put trash in the recycling bin and recyclables in the trash, ride our bicycle in the improper line, and borrow a stranger's Wi-Fi to download a book that we didn't pay for. Put simply, a world in which every law is always enforced would be a world in which everyone was a criminal. I tried to talk to Lindsay about all this, but though she was generally sympathetic to my concerns, she wasn't so sympathetic that she was ready to go off the grid, or even off Facebook or Instagram. If I did that, she said, I'd be giving up my art and abandoning my friends. You used to like being in touch with other people. She was right. She was right to be worried about me. She thought I was too tense, under too much stress. I was, not because of my work, but because of my desire to tell her a truth that I wasn't allowed to. I couldn't tell her that my former co-workers at the NSA target her for surveillance and read the love poems she texted me. I couldn't tell her that they could access all the photos she took, not just her public photos, but the intimate ones. I couldn't tell her that her information was being collected, that everyone's information was being collected, which was tantamount to a government threat. If you ever get out of line, we'll use your private life against you.